The brass bell above the door of Bella's Italian restaurant chimed softly as the lunch rush began to wind down. Margaret Thornton stood behind the hostess stand, surveying her kingdom with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent 20 years building something from nothing. White tablecloths, fresh flowers, waiters in crisp uniforms, everything perfect, everything controlled, everything the way she needed it to be. "Table for one, please." Margaret looked up from her reservation book and felt her smile freeze on her face. Standing in her pristine entryway was a black man in his late 40s, wearing clothes that had seen better days. A stained jacket, torn jeans, shoes held together with duct tape. His beard was unkempt, his hands dirty, and he carried the distinctive smell of someone who'd been sleeping rough. "I'm sorry," Margaret said, her voice cold and flat. "We're fully booked." The man looked around the half-empty dining room, then back at her. "It doesn't look full. Reservations only. You'll need to try somewhere else." "I have money." He pulled out a crumpled $20 bill. "I just want a meal, please. I haven't eaten in 2 days." Margaret's jaw tightened. She could feel her regular customers watching, could sense their discomfort. This was exactly the kind of situation she'd worked so hard to avoid. Bella's was an upscale establishment. It had a reputation. It catered to a certain clientele, and that clientele did not include homeless people off the street. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. This is a family establishment. I'm not causing any trouble. I just want food. If you don't leave immediately, I'll call the police." Margaret reached for the phone on her desk, her hand steady despite the uncomfortable flutter in her chest. Something about his eyes bothered her, something familiar that she couldn't quite place. The man stood there for a moment longer, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Then he turned and walked out, the brass bell chiming his exit like a small, sad song. Margaret watched him through the window as he sat down on the curb across the street, his head in his hands. She felt a brief pang of something, guilt, sympathy, but pushed it away. She'd worked too hard to let her restaurant become a shelter. This was business, nothing personal. She turned back to her reservations, dismissing the encounter from her mind. What Margaret Thornton didn't know was that the man sitting on that curb was David Mitchell. And 23 years ago, David Mitchell had been called by a different name, a name Margaret would have recognized instantly. He'd been called Danny Thornton, her younger brother. In the kitchen, Maria Rodriguez, the head chef and Margaret's only real friend, had watched the entire exchange through the service window. She'd been with Bella's for 15 years, had seen Margaret build this place from a struggling diner into Richmond's most respected Italian restaurant. But she'd also seen something else. The way Margaret held herself so rigid, so controlled, as if one moment of softness would cause everything to crumble. "That was harsh, even for you," Maria said quietly as Margaret entered the kitchen to check on the evening's prep. "I can't have homeless people scaring away paying customers, Maria. You know that." He wasn't scaring anyone, he just wanted food. "And if I serve him, then tomorrow 5 more show up, then 10, then my actual customers stop coming because they're uncomfortable. I didn't build this business by being soft." Maria studied her friend's face, seeing the walls that never quite came down. "What are you so afraid of, Margaret?" "I'm not afraid of anything. I'm being practical." But Maria had known Margaret long enough to recognize fear when she saw it. The question was, what was Margaret really afraid of? Homeless people hurting her business? Or something else entirely? Across the street, David Mitchell sat on the curb, trying to remember when his life had stopped making sense. The timeline was fuzzy. Years of addiction and homelessness had a way of blurring everything together, but he could remember the beginning clearly enough. 23 years ago, he'd been Danny Thornton, 17 years old, living in a small house in Richmond with his mother and his older sister Margaret, who was 20. Their father had died 2 years earlier, and their mother was dying of cancer. Margaret had dropped out of college to take care of her, working 2 jobs to keep the lights on. And Danny? Danny had been a stupid, scared kid who'd made the worst decision of his life. The day their mother died, Margaret had been at the hospital. Danny was supposed to meet her there, but instead, he'd gone to a party with his friends, got drunk, got high, and when he finally made it to the hospital, she was already gone. Margaret had been sitting alone in that sterile room with their mother's body, waiting for him. When he'd stumbled in, reeking of alcohol and weed, she'd looked at him with something he'd never seen in her eyes before. Not just anger, not just disappointment, complete and utter disgust. "Get out," she'd said, her voice dead calm. "Get out and don't ever come back." "Maggie, I'm sorry, Our mother died alone because you were too busy getting high. You're not my brother anymore. You're nothing to me." And Danny, drunk and high and drowning in guilt, had done exactly what she'd said. He'd left. He'd disappeared into the streets of Richmond. He'd told himself it was just for a few days, that he'd come back when Margaret calmed down, that he'd make it right. But a few days became a few weeks. A few weeks became months. And somewhere along the way, Danny Thornton had ceased to exist. He'd become David Mitchell, a name he'd made up to get a spot at a homeless shelter. And David Mitchell had spiraled deeper and deeper into addiction, until looking back at Danny Thornton felt like looking at someone else entirely. He'd tried to get clean dozens of times over the years. Sometimes he'd succeed for months. Once, he'd even held down a job for nearly a year. But something always pulled him back down: the guilt, the shame, the knowledge that he'd destroyed the only family he had left. 3 months ago, he'd finally gotten clean for good. It had taken a near-death overdose and a month in a recovery program, but something had shifted. He'd started to remember who he used to be. Started to wonder if maybe after 23 years, it was time to face what he'd run from. Today had been his first attempt. Walking into that restaurant, seeing Margaret's face for the first time in more than 2 decades. He'd hoped, foolishly he realized now, that maybe she'd recognize him. That maybe after all these years, she'd see past the dirt and the beard and the years of hard living and see her little brother. But she hadn't recognized him at all. She'd just seen another homeless person to be thrown out. David pulled out the photograph he kept in his jacket pocket. It was ancient, crumpled, barely recognizable. But he could still make out the images: a younger Margaret, smiling, arm around a teenage Danny, back when they were family, back before he'd destroyed everything. "I'm sorry, Maggie," he whispered to the photograph. "I'm so sorry." He didn't notice the car that had pulled up across the street, didn't notice the woman inside watching him through the window with curious eyes, didn't notice Maria Rodriguez taking a photograph of him with her phone, something about his profile triggering a memory she couldn't quite place. The afternoon sun was starting to fade when David finally stood up and walked away, heading back to the shelter where he'd been staying. Behind him, Bella's Italian restaurant continued its evening service, completely unaware that the man they'd turned away was the ghost of Margaret Thornton's past, finally come home. That evening, after the last customer had left and the staff had gone home, Margaret sat in her office doing paperwork. Numbers usually calmed her. Profit margins, inventory costs, payroll, these were things she could control, could predict, could manage. Unlike people, unlike family, unlike the feelings she'd spent 23 years burying so deep she'd almost convinced herself they didn't exist. But tonight the numbers wouldn't settle. She kept seeing that homeless man's face, those eyes. Why had they bothered her so much? Her phone rang. "Maria." "What is it? Did someone forget to lock up?" "No, Margaret. I need you to look at something." Maria's voice was strange, careful. "I'm sending you a photo." "Tell me what you see." Margaret's phone buzzed. She opened the image and saw a photograph of the homeless man from earlier, taken from across the street. He was looking down at something in his hands, his profile visible. And suddenly, Margaret couldn't breathe. Because she knew that profile. She'd grown up with that profile. She'd bandaged scraped knees under that profile. She'd taught that profile how to tie a tie for his first school dance. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." "Margaret, I think you need to look closer." But Margaret was already looking past the beard, past the years of damage, past the homelessness and the hard living, looking at the shape of his nose, the way he held his shoulders, the scar above his left eyebrow from when he'd fallen off his bike at age 12. "It can't be." "I think it is. I think that man is your brother." Margaret's hands were shaking so hard she dropped the phone. 23 years. 23 years she'd convinced herself that Danny was gone, that he'd moved on, that he was living his life somewhere far away where she didn't have to think about him. 23 years she'd told herself she didn't care. And all that time, he'd been here. In Richmond. Homeless, starving, sitting outside her restaurant, and she'd thrown him out like garbage. She'd thrown out her brother like garbage. Margaret Thornton, who'd spent 2 decades building walls to keep herself safe, felt every single one of them begin to crack. Margaret didn't sleep that night. She sat in her living room, surrounded by photo albums she hadn't opened in 23 years, staring at pictures of a boy who no longer existed, or so she'd thought. Danny at 6, missing his front teeth. Danny at 12, holding his first guitar. Danny at 15, graduation from middle school, their mother standing between them, smiling despite the cancer that was already eating her alive. And Margaret at 20, young and exhausted, trying to hold a family together while her mother died and her teenage brother spiraled out of control. She'd blamed him for so long. Blamed him for not being there when their mother passed. Blamed him for choosing drugs and alcohol over family. Blamed him for abandoning her when she needed him most. But sitting here now, looking at these photographs, Margaret forced herself to ask a question she'd avoided for 2 decades. Had Danny abandoned her? Or had she pushed him away? Get out, and don't ever come back. Those had been her words, her command, and he'd obeyed. Her phone buzzed. Maria again. Did you sleep? No. Are you going to find him? Margaret's hands tightened around her coffee mug. I don't know where to start. The shelter on 5th Street. That's where most of the homeless population stays. If he's still in Richmond, he might be there. What do I say to him, Maria? Sorry I threw you out yesterday. Sorry I told you to disappear 23 years ago and actually meant it. How about you start with I'm sorry and see where it goes from there? After Maria hung up, Margaret sat for another hour, paralyzed by fear and guilt and something she couldn't quite name. Then she stood up, grabbed her keys, and drove to 5th Street before she could change her mind. The Richmond Community Shelter was a converted warehouse that smelled like industrial cleaner and broken dreams. Margaret approached the front desk, her designer clothes and expensive handbag making her stand out like a diamond in dirt. Can I help you? The receptionist, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, barely looked up. I'm looking for someone, a man, black, late 40s, homeless. He might be using the name David Mitchell. Lady, I've got 200 people staying here. You got a picture? Margaret pulled out her phone showing the photograph Maria had sent. The receptionist studied it, then nodded slowly. Yeah, I know David. Good guy, keeps to himself. Been clean for 3 months. That's impressive around here. She paused. He's not in any trouble, is he? No, he's... Margaret's voice caught. He's family. The receptionist's eyebrows rose. Family, huh? Well, he's not here right now. He usually heads out after breakfast, spends the day looking for work, comes back around dinner time. Where does he look for work? Construction sites, mostly. Day labor. There's a spot on Riverside Avenue where contractors come to pick up workers. He might be there. Margaret thanked her and left, driving to Riverside Avenue with her heart pounding. She found the spot, a parking lot where about 30 men stood around, some drinking, coffee from thermoses, some smoking, all waiting for someone to offer them a day's work. And there, standing slightly apart from the others, was Danny. No, she corrected herself. David. He goes by David now. She parked across the street and watched him for 15 minutes, trying to gather courage. He looked so tired, so worn down by life. The brother she remembered had been full of energy, always laughing, always moving. This man stood still, quiet, as if he'd learned that taking up too much space was dangerous. What had his life been like these past 23 years? What had he endured? What had she forced him to endure by sending him away? Margaret got out of her car and started walking toward him. She'd made it halfway across the parking lot when a contractor's truck pulled up and called out for workers. David and 5 other men climbed into the back. "Wait!" Margaret called out, but her voice was lost in the noise of the engine. She watched helplessly as the truck drove away, Danny disappearing once again. She went back to the shelter that evening, waited in her car in the parking lot like a stalker, watching for him to return. Other residents came and went, giving her suspicious looks. Rich white lady sitting outside a homeless shelter wasn't exactly common. At 6:47 p.m., she saw him walking up the street, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion. He had dirt on his clothes and face. He'd clearly spent the day doing manual labor. But he was carrying a small grocery bag, and through the plastic, Margaret could see a sandwich and a bottle of water. She got out of her car. "David?" He turned, and his eyes widened when he saw her. Recognition flashed across his face, not recognition of who she was, but recognition of the woman who'd thrown him out of her restaurant yesterday. "I'm not causing any trouble," he said immediately, stepping back. "I'm just trying to get inside. I know, I'm not here to... I just need to talk to you. Look, lady, I get it. You don't want people like me near your business. Message received. I won't come back." "That's not why I'm here." David looked confused. "Then why are you here?" Margaret took a deep breath. This was it. The moment she'd been avoiding for 23 years. The moment when she had to face what she'd done, who she'd become, and whether it was possible to undo any of it. "Because I need to ask you something. And I need you to be honest with me." "Okay. What's your real name?" David froze. For a long moment, he just stared at her, his face cycling through confusion, fear, and finally, terribly, hope. "Why do you want to know? Please, just tell me." His voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "Danny. My real name is Danny." Margaret felt tears streaming down her face. "Danny Thornton?" He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Oh, God, Danny, it's me. It's Maggie." Danny staggered backward like he'd been hit. "What?" "Number, no, you don't, you can't. I didn't recognize you yesterday." "I'm so sorry. I didn't recognize my own brother." "You're not, you can't be Maggie. Maggie was..." He looked at her expensive clothes, her styled hair, her manicured nails. "You're not her." "I am. I'm Margaret Thornton. You're my little brother, and I've been looking for you since yesterday when someone made me see what I was too blind to notice." She stepped closer. "Danny, I'm so sorry. For everything. For that day at the hospital. For what I said to you. For not looking for you all these years. You told me to leave." His voice was flat, emotionless, the defense mechanism of someone who'd been hurt too many times. "You told me I was nothing to you. I was wrong. I was so wrong. I was 20 years old, Danny. Our mother had just died, and I was angry and hurt, and I said things I didn't mean. You meant them. I saw your face. Maybe I did mean them then. But not now. Not for a long time." Margaret wiped her tears, not caring who was watching. "I thought you'd left Richmond. I thought you'd built a new life somewhere. I convinced myself you were better off without me." "Better off?" Danny laughed, a bitter sound. "Maggie, I've been homeless for 18 years. I'm a recovering addict. I sleep in a shelter and beg for work. Does that look better off to you?" "No, God, no. And that's my fault. If I hadn't sent you away, don't." He held up his hand. "Don't take responsibility for my choices. I'm the one who got high the day Mom died. I'm the one who became an addict. I'm the one who stayed away even after I should have come back." He looked down at his hands. "I was ashamed, Maggie. I was so ashamed of what I'd become. I couldn't face you. And I was too proud to look for you. Too busy building my perfect life, my perfect restaurant, my perfect walls." Margaret's voice broke. "I threw you out yesterday, Danny. My own brother came to me hungry, and I threw him out like garbage. You didn't know it was me. Would it have mattered? Should it have mattered?" She stepped closer. "What kind of person have I become? What kind of person throws out a hungry man asking for food?" They stood there in the shelter parking lot, Two people who'd once been family, trying to navigate 23 years of pain and mistakes. "I don't know how to fix this," Margaret whispered. "I don't know how to make up for all those years." "Maybe you can't," Danny said quietly. "Maybe some things stay broken. Or maybe we start over. Maybe we try." Danny looked at his sister, older, harder, but still somehow the girl who'd raised him after their father died. "I don't know if I can trust you again, Maggie. I don't know if I can trust anyone." "Then let me prove it. Let me show you I've changed, that I want to change." She reached into her purse and pulled out her business card. "This is my restaurant. Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. Come see me, please." Danny took the card, staring at it like it might bite him. "And if I don't come? Then I'll come back here every day until you do. Because I'm not losing you again, Danny. Not when I just found you." She walked back to her car, leaving Danny standing in the parking lot, holding a business card that represented everything he'd lost and maybe, just maybe, a chance to find it again. Danny Thornton didn't sleep that night either. He lay on his bunk in the shelter, staring at Margaret's business card like it was a winning lottery ticket he didn't quite believe was real. Bella's Italian restaurant. His sister owned Bella's, the place everyone in Richmond talked about, the place you needed reservations weeks in advance. His sister, who he remembered struggling to pay rent on their tiny apartment, now owned the most successful restaurant in the city, and she'd thrown him out without recognizing him. Part of him wanted to tear up the card and forget yesterday ever happened. It would be easier that way, safer. He'd survived 23 years by not hoping for things, by not letting himself want what he couldn't have. But another part of him, the part that was still 17-year-old Danny Thornton, the kid who'd worshipped his big sister, wanted desperately to believe that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late. At 8:45 a.m., Danny stood outside Bella's, wearing the cleanest clothes he owned. He'd spent an hour at the shelter's bathroom, scrubbing himself until his skin was raw, trying to look presentable. But looking at his reflection in the restaurant's window, he still saw what everyone else saw, a homeless man who didn't belong. He almost walked away, almost convinced himself this was a mistake. Then the door opened, and Margaret stood there. "You came," she said, and her voice was so full of relief that Danny felt something crack in his chest. "You asked me to." "Come in, please." The restaurant was empty, not yet open for lunch service. Margaret led him to a corner booth and disappeared into the kitchen. Danny sat awkwardly, his hands fidgeting with the menu, feeling like an imposter in this beautiful space his sister had built. When Margaret returned, she was carrying 2 plates of food: eggs Benedict, fresh fruit, coffee, orange juice. She set one plate in front of him and took the seat across with her own. "When's the last time you had a real breakfast?" she asked. "I can't remember." "Then eat. Please." Danny picked up his fork with shaking hands. The food was incredible, of course it was, but he could barely taste it over the lump in his throat. Margaret ate slowly, watching him with eyes that kept filling with tears she tried to hide. "I looked through photo albums last night," Margaret said finally. "Do you remember that Christmas when you were 10? You wanted that guitar so badly, and I worked double shifts for 2 months to afford it." "I remember. I still have it, actually. It's at a storage unit, one of the few things I didn't sell over the years." Danny paused. "You taught me how to play Jingle Bells." "You were terrible." "I was 10. They both smiled, a small, tentative thing. Then Margaret's smile faded. "I need to tell you something, Danny. I need to explain who I became and why." She took a breath. "After you left, I was so angry. At you, at Mom for dying, at Dad for dying before her, at the whole world. I decided that if I was going to survive, I had to be hard. I had to be perfect. I couldn't let anyone in, couldn't let anything hurt me. So you built this." Danny gestured at the restaurant. "I built walls." The restaurant was just the physical manifestation. Margaret's voice cracked. "I became exactly the kind of person I would have hated when I was 20. Cold, judgmental, someone who looks at a hungry man and sees a problem instead of a person. Maggie, let me finish. Please." She wiped her eyes. "Yesterday, When you walked into my restaurant, I saw everything I'd trained myself to see. A homeless person. A threat to my business. Someone who didn't belong in my perfect world. I didn't see my brother. I didn't see a human being who was suffering. I saw an inconvenience. You didn't know it was me. That's what makes it worse, Danny. It shouldn't have mattered who you were. I should have helped you because you needed help, because it was the right thing to do, because that's who Mom raised me to be. Margaret reached across the table, her hand hovering near his. I don't know if you can forgive me. For that day at the hospital, for not looking for you, for yesterday. But I want to try to be better. I want to be the sister you deserved. Danny looked at her hand, at this woman who was his sister but also a stranger, and felt 23 years of pain and anger and loneliness threatening to overwhelm him. I was so scared to come back, he whispered. Even when I got clean, even when I started remembering who I used to be, I was terrified to face you, because I knew what I'd see in your eyes, the same disgust I saw that day at the hospital. Danny, but you know what's worse? Yesterday, when you threw me out, you didn't even see me enough to be disgusted. I was just nothing. He finally looked up at her. Do you know how many times over the years I walked past this restaurant? How many times I stood outside wondering if you were in there, wondering if you ever thought about me? Every day, Margaret said, tears streaming down her face. I thought about you every single day. I just convinced myself you were better off without me. I wasn't. I needed you, Maggie. I needed my sister. I know, and I'm here now, if you'll let me. Danny looked at this woman, his sister, who'd raised him, who'd hurt him, who'd thrown him out and then spent all night looking for him. He thought about the walls she'd built and the walls he'd built. He thought about their mother, who'd taught them that family was everything, and how badly they'd both forgotten that lesson. I don't know how to do this, he said. I don't know how to be your brother again. Then we'll figure it out together. One day at a time. Margaret finally took his hand. I'm not asking you to trust me completely. I'm not asking you to forget the past. I'm just asking for a chance to show you that I can change, that we can change. Danny squeezed her hand, and it felt like coming home. Over the next 3 months, Margaret and Danny rebuilt what had been broken. It wasn't easy. There were arguments and setbacks and moments when they both wondered if some things really were too broken to fix. Margaret hired Danny to work in her restaurant, first in the kitchen, washing dishes and helping with prep work. The staff was skeptical at first, but Maria took him under her wing, teaching him everything she knew about cooking. Danny threw himself into the work with the intensity of someone who'd been drowning and finally found solid ground. He moved out of the shelter into a small apartment Margaret helped him rent. She offered to let him stay with her, but they both knew he needed his own space, his own dignity. Danny attended AA meetings religiously, working through his demons one day at a time. And slowly, carefully, they learned how to be siblings again. One evening, 6 months after their reunion, Danny was closing up the restaurant when he found Margaret in her office, looking at the old photograph he'd carried all those years, the one of them smiling, arms around each other. Where did you get this? She asked. I've kept it with me since the day I left. Even when I had nothing else, I kept that picture. Danny sat down across from her. It reminded me of who I used to be. Who we used to be. Margaret smiled through her tears. I have the original at home, same photo, same frame. I looked at it every night for 23 years, wondering where you were. I was never that far away, Maggie. I was always right here in Richmond. I know that now. She stood up and hugged him tightly. And I'm never letting you disappear again. A year after Danny walked into Bella's as a homeless man, he walked in again. This time as the sous chef, his name listed on a plaque by the door. Margaret had created a new position just for him, recognizing his natural talent and his dedication. But more than that, she'd created something else, a program called Second Chances. Every Tuesday, Bella's served free meals to anyone who needed them. No questions asked, no judgment, just food and dignity and the understanding that everyone deserves a chance to be seen as human. On the first Tuesday of the program, Margaret stood at the door, greeting every person who walked in. And and when she saw a young black woman, dirty and scared and clearly homeless, Margaret didn't hesitate. "Welcome to Bella's," she said warmly. "Please come in. Your family here." Because Margaret had learned the hardest way that family wasn't just about blood. It was about seeing people, really seeing them, and choosing love over fear. It was about admitting when you're wrong and fighting like hell to make it right. And it was about understanding that second chances aren't just given. They're earned one day at a time, one act of kindness at a time, one person at a time. If this story touched your heart, remember that the homeless person you pass on the street has a story. They have a family. They were someone's child, someone's sibling, someone's friend. They deserve to be seen, to be heard, to be treated with dignity. Margaret's restaurant serves food, but what it really serves is something far more important: recognition that every human being matters, regardless of where they've been or what they've lost. Because sometimes, the person you're helping might be closer than you think. And sometimes, the person who needs help the most is yourself.